The obstruction by the insurrectionist Confederacy seeking the eradication of the United States by the collapse of the system by the misuse of weapons not available to the general public, which then censors it from the use of the courts, which then prevents the capacity to self-defense or the Second Amendment, the right to use the government as an arms, which then facilitates the function of their subversion of their thefts, which then engages in the collapse and subversions by their criminal racketeering operations in order to collapse financial and educational and other contracts, as well as key associations, which then materializes their communist control and central planning over the system, which then materializes the capacity to engage in their collapse of the United States society and government, which then acknowledges their obstruction against David, such as the targeting for their theft by forgery using those tools in order to dissolve the trust that he would have had facilitated by Don Bowles Sr., which then would have actively, without their control or restraints, have sustained itself to the exponential profits, which, in connection to David's nonprofits, such as the David Foundation Incorporated, materializes the activity without the obstructions in order to bar the paperwork from the IPO to it, would have materialized all of the necessary certifications and licenses and the rest of it in order to materialize the proper employees in order to structure the function which they were seeking to cripple by their hybrid warfare to overthrow the United States and destroy its population. To that extent, the material functions acknowledges in the obstructions the capacity for David to have won the lottery several times, including with the magazine series, which would have provided him 300 $1,000 from the magazine and 999 million three times from various lotteries at a very minimum. And to the extent that the foundation nonprofit would have received or been the generator of the lottery, generating its capacity to digest it, automates a primary source of income in order to materialize these functions. Now, while David's trades with that system would have actively sustained the network, including the zombie insurance protocol structure, which then engages in the various insurance protections, which generating its own clientele materializes the capacity to have sold the insurance as well as loans, materializing the function of the consistent profiteering mechanisms of those exchanges alongside of the regular stock market operations, which then the active trades leveraging David's advantages from his various sources of income materializes into the operation of a consistent um, cycling resource, which then generates the exponential amounts of money. Now, the trust that they wanted to dissolve against the law that David was owed to not be disrupted would have sustained in that growth beyond $10 million in active sustained maintenance by the Bank of America, which would have generated the pretense of the restoration of the rest of the network, including David starting his brokerage from his education, from the obstructed contracts, which would have sustained the rest of the certifications and licenses that he would have needed in order to have done the other professions, which, being obstructed, would have consisted of a maintained source of income as legitimate employment by himself as self-employment. To this extent, this consistent racketeering operation of their terrorist operations systematically collapses the extraordinary wealth that would have been generated from these estimates. This does not include the function of all of the other diverse investments in strategies that David would have implemented from those unobstructed values. And the objective of this terrorist operation is the criminal censorship of David's speech. And as we all know, money is speech, and the function of the sabotage of these contracts and the barring of association against the law was derived by the impact to limit David's capacity to have a sober, educated speech with the government, which is criminal censorship for insurrection against these United States. That includes the function of the nonprofits discussed having purchased and taken over the Linwood House, which is, according to the unobstructed version, supposed to be the School of Hard Knocks campus, amongst many others, which then being under that would have been derived by the life insurance of Don Senior Bowles, which would have been a primary source of many of the incomes, which being obstructed was also murdered, and thus the action of having murdered him facilitated the capacity of the life insurance, which would have put, according to those obstructed contracts, David in charge of managing the insurance mechanisms for the rest of the family, which then would materialize the capacity for the nonprofit to have purchased the trust portion of the house, which then materializes the protection of the other access from the protected benefactors, such as David's siblings, which would have actively been a part of that, and the taxes and insurances and the rest of it would have been fully covered by the nonprofit sustaining itself from the normal operations, which then would be able to disseminate its nonprofit benefits to the general public from those resources and employees, sustaining itself from the various inputs of resources. To this extent, the mechanism of traumatizing the general public is for the purpose of threats to national security against these United States and the destruction of its people. Now, these various terrorist operations by the white supremacist communist Confederacy materializes the activities of the communist revolutions, which facilitate the systemic disillusionment of the general public from uh, a constitutional republic into a democracy for the disillusionment and disadvantages derived by democracy, which then materializes the stages of the hybrid warfare in order to collapse it in its entirety by the anarchy unrestrained by law. And the action of those terrorist operations without restraint of law materializes the super minority being in control of the supermajority on the basis of that criminal violence from their hyperactivity derived by uh, their insurrectionist motives, which then facilitates the capacity of their voter fraud to have barred all of the Americans from the election systems, materializing an anti American system, which then counters and replaces it with the fraudulent exchanges by the criminal ex post facto and other strictly prohibited policies by the Constitution, which, being ignored as an enemy, is then subverted for the collapse of the general system into the degrowth by the demoralized Confederates who, having been demoralized, facilitate their compliance under the struggling operations in order to engage in the criminal capture of each of the parties to put them through the harassment struggling sessions, which then facilitates their traumatization and removal of from society to either be converted or to be abused infinitum without legal operations by the prohibited weapons, which were not allowed to be used against the general public as they claim that they are classified, which would require those weapons to be available to the general public, as the use of weapons against the general public has to be accessible to the general public, which means they are not secrets, which means by definition they have to be able to be accessible to court, which means those who use those weapons are obligated to submit those records to the courts and to Congress, etc., materializing them as a public record without the capacity to fraudulently argue their secrecy in order to engage in their criminal insurrection in hatred of these United States. Now, these criminal processes being used for their communist degrowth structure materialize the obstruction of contracts, which then obstructs capacity to status, which then degrades and dissolves human decency, which is an objective punishment without an offense, which then materializes the activity of their criminal operations and perpetual harassments for their controls in order to engage in the traumatization of the properties in question, which then in those damages derive the defamations and false excuses on the basis of their control by the use of those faculties, which then materializes their obligation to submit it to the public record, which then is refused to under that fraudulent argument, which then is internally demoralized to that action in order to engage in the captured function of the system not working correctly, then gets the communist propaganda trigger to engage in the function of people being humiliated into compliance, such as the embarrassment of being caught without the resources, including the function of assaulting them in order to make a public defamation so that the person looks less refined than they would have otherwise been without those criminal subversions, engaging in that criminal manipulation, materializing the system of defamation in the smear factory in order to manufacture their communist insurrection for the white supremacist revolution, which has systemically set up the traps for the general public, including cultist revolutionaries, which, not being the right type of white, are set up to be sacrificed at maturity, that their inherent inferiorities engaged in the function of the struggling session for their survival as a political identity will easily be able to be dissolved upon that radical revolutionary violence with their pre-established weaknesses deriving the guaranteed destruction for the right type of whites to conquer and to kill them in absolute decimation and slaughter. And to these white supremacist anarchist extremists, the function should prove that they should be compelled to become homeless for an extended period of time, that they might truly understand what anarchy means before they've destroyed the system completely and left it entirely vulnerable without remedy, which would generate the same consequences as their intentional homelessness, and to the extent that their homelessness generating the anarchy of their systemic unsafe conditions by their being put into a wilderness function where it is functionally anarchist and any predator can destroy them at any time, materializes the function that should scare them straight. And these same abusers would seek to do the same to their victims who otherwise would not have been in that type of situation or approved of those types of policies or subversions to the general security. Materializing that activity functions as their wake-up call that they need to grow the fuck up at some point like a goddamn fucking adult, which as a Confederate transsexual they are allergic to. And the answer, of course, is that those who support those terrorist anarcho operations, barring the information from the general public so that they can be manipulated and not processed accurately, being their psychotic selves, are fundamentally allergic to the possibility of making adult men. And thus you have women and you have their trans community of anti-human psychopaths, which, having been bred to not be adults and being bred to be psychotic, materializes the exponential increase of the dangers of their treacheries, which become fundamental to their core identity, materializing the reproduction and cycling of their threats to the general public, guaranteeing the arbitrary disadvantages of their rape culture, which is the primary source of their resources and funding from the criminal market, where the crimes being opposed then become hyper accelerated in price and then are compelled to sell in order to guarantee guaranteed profits and returns for their permanent racketeering operations. These manufactured problems includes their traumatization of the entire world order to put it out of sync, such as the creation of the war in Ukraine, which would not have existed because of David Bowles, who, having created without the obstruction the contract schedules, which then would have generated his exponential fortunes, to be able to sell the rights to the franchise operation expansion or the predetermined amount of money. They purchase the finished arrangement, which then facilitates his funding, which would then start to ensure the former Soviet Union from the collapse traumas, which then would have facilitated David's control over that maintenance, making David specifically over the security interest for the Russians, which are reacting to the security threats derived by the communist white supremacist Confederacy, which allows him the leverage in order to negotiate the settled peace, as long as he would be able to have had an American functioning government in order to restrain the threat by the Confederates. Now, this includes the other traumas, such as the crash of '08, which is an international trauma, which then facilitates the connection to the assumption of the forming of a kingdom in his name, which then would facilitate the steward's automated control over that functional kingdom with the treaty, which includes the function of consulates and embassies, which then includes the treaty that it would have sustained with the United States, Israel, and many of the others, which then facilitates David's consulates in Israel, which would have been in the locations that many mislabel as Palestine, which David had to be removed in order to engage in the genocide against said Palestine, um, which is only Palestine by virtue of his absence. And the consulate existing in that area instead having the economic insurance treaty with the Israelis would have had to have protected the civilian populations that are owed to be allowed in that area, would have actively increased their security and sort of threatening it. And having removed David and hyper accelerated the functional terrorist threats such as Hezbollah, um, materializes the action of double agents in the Israeli government seeking, as Jewish anti Semites, the collapse of Israel for mass sacrifice of Jews in order to progress their anti Jewish agenda on the world stage, which may include the function of the creation of Revelation's government from their satanic antichrist operations, and their capacity to have managed that under the protocols of learned elders of Zion, as is encouraged by their deal with the devil in collaboration with the white supremacist Confederacy, which is presumed to have wrote the forgeries for the protocols of learned elders of Zion, which then would have used the Terror Factory operation tactics in order to convert Jews into anti-Semites, into supporters for the propagation of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, turning them into the de facto gimmick, which then materializes the capacity and excuse to attack Israel in the war on terror or the war on terror policies, which then facilitates the capacity to argue to hunt for Jews around the world. And whereas Adolf Hitler just wanted to get rid of the Jews out of Germany, the Confederates who paid to create the Nazis, who made Hitler, uh, want to be able to hunt them throughout the world so that they do not have any place, making Adolf Hitler officially better for the Jews than anyone who supports Lindsey Graham's Confederacy. Now, in many of these funding epidemics for the censorship of that activity, there is a fundamental belief that there is a position for intelligence oversight with Congress, which they had targeted illegally in order to gut in contempt of Congress and in malicious insurrection to overthrow the United States government, um, restraining the investigators of their operations, and thus the action of censoring those who have jurisdiction over them as a criminal act and rebuff against the legal proceedings. To this extent, you have materially dissolved the entire function of the United States government and have de facto committed an insurrection by a series of usurpations, disqualifying the function as a criminal act. To that extent, the function, the restoration of David's character to the position of intelligence oversight with the restoration of the department for Congress's oversight of the executive materializes the obligations of that actions, which disqualifies the voter fraud elected leaders, such as the ones who have made it into replacing the Congress in the anti-Congress of the Confederacy, which then, being disbarred for their insurrection, is a self-enacting function. And to that extent, David isn't really seeking an executive position, and thus is not subordinate to any of the president's actions, but is an action of the legislator to engage in the enforcement of the legislative function, overseeing them, requiring the function of investigators, requiring the function of a law enforcement mechanism or the capacity to military police or police capable of easily arresting, detaining, and doing all of the law enforcement functions against the military, which, being investigated as a subordinate, is to be considered the normal function, and the exact words and procedures would have actively been obstructed, redacted, and subverted and put in the wrong order, in which case it has to be re-examined by the function of the duel in order to get the specifics. Now, all of the policies that would have been derived by the Confederates' advancements to justify their criminal actions would then be nullified upon investigation and examination, as their acts in subversion to overthrow the United States government by the purging of the Americans from those roles materializes as an act of treason, disqualifying the acts, requiring them to be punished for the attempt instead of validated in their insurrections. The Khrushchev 1959 quote of demoralization actively incorporates the function of many tier functions of the demoralizing process by their espionage of the Soviet Union against these United States, facilitating the function of various staggered positions, such as the active incorporation into insurgencies inside the intelligence community for the use of secrecy, protecting the demoralizing processes for communism, such as the advancement of the established Confederacy through secret societies, which then can produce for them the satisfactory effect of the communist overthrow of the United States without presumptive protections from their violations of law. And this would expressly be demonstrated by current practices of violation of those laws secured by the Constitution being ignored by the insurrectionists, white supremacists, for their communism in their insurrection against this country. We communists will quickly bury you. From Khrushchev, 1959. Your children's children will live under communism. You Americans are so gullible. No, you won't accept communism outright, but we will